Over 70% of modern adults admit to lying awake at night, paralyzed by chronic stress and the exhausting need to control every single outcome of their lives. Are we truly steering the ship, or are we just drowning in our own anxiety while pretending to be the captains? What if the heavy burnout you are feeling right now is not a sign of failure, but a direct result of trying to play God in your own story? The phrase "trust God" has unfortunately become a shallow social media slogan, a quick band-aid we throw at our problems while we secretly continue to carry the crushing weight of tomorrow. I remember lying awake at 3 o'clock in the morning a few years ago, staring at the ceiling as my first major business venture collapsed, feeling a level of terror that squeezed the air right out of my lungs because my perfect plan had failed. In that darkness, I realized that my obsession with control was actually a prison of my own making, and that I had never truly practiced the faith I preached on Sundays. Some might argue that letting go and trusting an unseen higher power is just a lazy escape, a convenient excuse to avoid taking personal responsibility for our actions. But true surrender is not passive laziness. It is the ultimate act of courage that requires us to break our addiction to certainty so we can finally tap into a strength far greater than our own. The moment you decide to trust God completely, the first thing that crumbles is the exhausting illusion that you were ever in control to begin with. We often mistake control for safety, holding on to our plans so tightly that our knuckles turn white, believing that our worry can somehow shield us from the unpredictable storms of life. But real faith begins exactly where your human control ends, shifting your position from a desperate fixer to a peaceful observer. Think of a professional skydiver plunging through the open air from thousands of feet above the ground. As they fall through the wind, they do not fight the terrifying gravity or attempt to build a solid bridge in midair with their own hands. Instead, they pull the cord and surrender their entire weight to the parachute, allowing the fabric to catch them and turn a violent drop into a breathtaking flight. When the Bible commands us in Proverbs chapter 3 to trust in the Lord with all our heart and lean not on our own understanding, it is not asking us to shut down our brains. It is an invitation to stop forcing our limited human logic onto an unlimited divine canvas, which is an incredibly freeing realization. I used to believe that if I did not micromanage every single detail of my daily schedule, my entire world would fall apart. But I had to learn the hard way that letting go of the steering wheel does not mean you are crashing. It means you are finally letting the rightful pilot take over. Another profound transformation that occurs when you surrender your life to God is that your fears lose their power, not because your problems vanish, but because your spiritual focus shifts. Many people falsely assume that deep faith acts as a magical shield that instantly clears the skies and silences every difficult circumstance in their lives. But the reality of walking with God is that the winds may still howl and the waves may still crash around your feet while you remain completely untouched inside. Picture a seasoned meteorologist standing directly in the path of a Category 5 hurricane, surrounded by flying debris and violent sheets of torrential rain. Yet they are completely calm and safe because they are positioned inside a heavily reinforced concrete research bunker with double-paned soundproof glass. The chaos outside is still very real and destructive, but their immediate environment is defined by absolute stillness and security. This is exactly what happened when the Apostle Peter stepped out of the boat to walk on the water toward Jesus in the middle of a raging storm. The gospel narrative explicitly notes that Jesus did not calm the wind before calling Peter out into the deep. The tempest was still roaring with full force. Peter only began to sink into the dark water the exact moment he pulled his gaze away from Christ and started measuring the terrifying height of the waves with his human eyes. I must confess that I still experience moments of sudden panic when unexpected financial pressures or sudden crises hit my household. But I am learning that courage is not the total absence of fear. It is the deliberate decision to look at the greatness of God instead of the size of the storm. When you finally cast your burdens onto God, you immediately experience a secondary challenge that many people are completely unprepared for, which is the sudden and uncomfortable vacuum of having nothing left to worry about. As human beings, we have become deeply addicted to our own stress because anxiety mistakenly feels like productivity, and obsessing over a problem gives us the false sensation that we are actually doing something to fix it. But true surrender requires you to step away from that toxic comfort zone, leaving a massive empty space in your mind that must be filled with divine reassurance instead of human panic. Think of an exhausted rock climber who has been hanging onto a vertical cliff face for hours, carrying a massive backpack stuffed with heavy, useless rocks that are dragging them down toward the abyss. Realizing that survival is impossible with that weight, they take a deep breath, slice the straps with a knife, and watch the heavy pack plunge thousands of feet down into the canyon below. In that exact second, their body experiences a strange and disorienting sensation of lightness, a sudden emptiness where the familiar crushing weight used to be, before they can fully enjoy the freedom to scale the peak. The scripture in 1 Peter chapter 5 commands us to cast all our anxiety on him because he cares for us, using a powerful Greek verb that implies a violent, one-time action of throwing a heavy object away from yourself forever. I used to laugh at my own spiritual hypocrisy because I would spend an hour on my knees praying and giving my problems to God, only to stand up and immediately mentally pick those exact same worries right back up. We must learn to sit quietly in the stillness that follows our prayers, resisting the childish urge to reclaim the heavy burdens that God has already carried away from our shoulders. A very common misconception about fully handing your life over to God is the comforting belief that you will immediately be led into green pastures and quiet waters. However, the historical reality of faith demonstrates that the road to spiritual maturity almost always detour directly through a harsh, barren desert. This painful season is not a divine punishment for your past mistakes, but a necessary process designed to systematically purge the remaining traces of your old addiction to control. Look at a raw, rusted steel blade being thrust deep into the roaring center of a 1,000-degree blacksmith furnace. As the heavy hammer strikes the glowing metal over and over again, an outside observer might think the iron is being violently destroyed and broken. But the master blacksmith knows that this intense heat and crushing pressure is the only way to drive out the hidden impurities, shaping the brittle metal into a sharp, unbreakable masterpiece. The Old Testament story of Joseph perfectly mirrors this grueling transformation during his long, silent years in an Egyptian dungeon. He was betrayed by his own blood, falsely accused of a terrible crime, and completely forgotten in the dark. Yet God was using that isolation to forge the character of a future ruler. When you are in the middle of your own emotional or financial desert, it is incredibly easy to give into despair and believe that God has entirely abandoned you. But I have discovered in my own darkest moments that the terrifying silence of God is not an absence of his presence, but the quiet concentration of a craftsman completing his finest work. When your old ego finally dies in the quiet isolation of the desert, a completely new internal navigation system is activated within your soul. Surrendering to God demands that you willingly blind your physical eyes to the terrifying statistics of the world so that your spiritual eyes can finally open. This advanced level of faith often forces you to abandon standard human logic entirely, making decisions that seem absolutely foolish to those who only trust what they can touch. Think of the sophisticated autopilot and radar array of a massive commercial airliner flying directly through a dense, pitch-black thunderstorm at midnight. The seasoned pilot cannot see a single foot in front of the cockpit window, as blinding rain and thick clouds completely erase the horizon from their view. Yet they do not panic or grab the controls in fear, because they choose to rely entirely on the invisible radar data flashing on their instrument panel to guide them to a safe landing. The author of Hebrews explicitly states that without faith, it is completely impossible to please God, because divine relationship requires us to believe in his unseen reality. We see this radical trust when Abraham packed his bags and traveled toward an unknown land, moving forward solely on a promise without needing a physical map. I used to reject anything that did not make perfect sense to my analytical mind, demanding a detailed guarantee before I would take a single step forward. But I have discovered that the most beautiful miracles in life always occur right after you cross the boundary of your own human understanding. Ultimately, placing your absolute trust in God is not a fragile escape mechanism designed for the weak who want to hide from reality. It is the ultimate act of defiance against a culture that demands you to worry, requiring the raw courage of a warrior willing to step into the dark without a torch. When you finally stop relying on your own limited strength, you stop surviving, and you finally begin to truly live. Thank you so very much for watching this video until the very end. And please consider subscribing to the channel right now to join our growing community of faith.